From The American Family, a True Horror Tale. The year was 1912. America had become a battleground in its own right. Civil unrest had turned into open conflict, and the countryside was no longer a safe haven. Sirens no longer signaled rescue. They screamed of doom, streets bled smoke, and the skies above cities glowed an angry red, not with sunset, but with fire. The war wasn't just on the front lines anymore, it was in people's homes. Amid the chaos there was a family, large, close-knit, and full of hope, clinging to one another as the world crumbled around them. 12 souls, bound by blood and desperation. They lived in the outskirts of a now-ruined town near the southern edge of the Appalachian forest, hoping their quiet existence would be overlooked by the violence spreading like a disease across the land. But one night, the fire came for them too. A sudden air raid shattered their world. Windows burst inward, the roof split, screams pierced the night as buildings were reduced to splinters. Michael, with the eldest son at 34, had been out gathering supplies when it began. By the time he reached home, half the house was gone. His father's body lay in the hallway, still shielding one of the younger cousins. His sister was crushed beneath the staircase. Fire ate through the remaining walls. Screaming echoed from every direction. Neighbors, friends, family. Smoke blurred vision. Grief would have to wait. There was no time to bury the dead. Michael grabbed his daughter Lily, a quiet girl who hadn't made a sound since witnessing her school collapse, and ran. His younger brother Thomas, just 19, dragged their mother Eleanor from the back room. Blood seeped from her temple, but she was alive. 4 remained. They didn't use the roads. Roads meant patrols. Roads meant death. Instead, they vanished into the trees, guided only by the moonlight and the memory of trails from childhood picnics. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. No more bombs, no more screams, only the rustling of the trees and the crunch of frozen leaves beneath their feet. They walked for 2 nights, resting only when Eleanor collapsed from exhaustion. Their breaths came in sharp, white clouds. The cold forest wrapped around them like a warning. Michael remembered stories his grandfather once told him. Stories of the old woods. Not just about wolves or bears, but of other things. Things that lived before the first settlers came. He used to laugh at those tales. Now, in the heart of that ancient forest, they didn't seem so funny. They found shelter near a frozen stream, a shallow cave partly hidden behind a wall of vines. It was dry, narrow, and just large enough for 4 people to huddle inside. Thomas started a small fire using what little dry wood they could find, shielding the glow with a jacket to keep it from drawing attention. Lily still hadn't spoken. The girl just sat in the corner of the cave, her wide eyes staring out into the forest. At times, she seemed to be watching something moving between the trees. But when anyone looked, nothing was there. Michael brushed it off as trauma. Children see things when they're afraid. That night, Eleanor dreamt of voices calling her name. Soft, familiar, and strangely kind. They came from just outside the cave. When she woke up, there were footprints in the snow. Human footprints. Bare. But no one had left the cave, not even once. By morning, their food was gone. Michael was sure he had packed enough for 3 days. Now, only crumbs remained. Blaming raccoons or some forest animal seemed easy. But no creature had left tracks. Only the bare human prints that circled the cave once before, vanishing into the frost. They couldn't go back. The towns were ruins, full of roaming soldiers and burned-out shelters. They had to go forward, deeper into the woods. On the 3rd day, the trees began to change. The trunks grew wider, older, with bark so dark it looked scorched. Thomas noticed that none of the trees had birds, no nests, no sounds, just silence, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional low wind that never seemed to move the branches. At one point, Lily finally spoke. She pointed toward the trees and whispered, "He's watching us." Everyone froze. Michael knelt in front of her, gripping her tiny shoulders gently. "Who's watching us, baby?" She didn't answer. She just stared into the woods with wide, unblinking eyes. Thomas laughed nervously. Probably just saw a deer. But Lily shook her head slowly. "He has no eyes." That night, no one slept. They took turns keeping watch, though none of them could tell if they were awake or dreaming. Shadows moved between the trees, long stretched forms that didn't match any human shape. Something whistled in the dark, but the tune was broken, like an old music box with broken teeth. They had no choice but to move forward, though each step felt heavier than the last. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, pine needles, and something faintly metallic, like blood. The forest, once a place of childhood memories and adventures, had become a maze of dark whispers and strange sounds. The deeper they went, the more the world outside seemed to vanish. Eleanor's condition worsened with every passing hour. Her fever raged, and her face had grown pale, as if the very life was being drained from her. Michael kept trying to convince himself that it was just exhaustion, the effects of the cold and fear, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, not just with her, but with everything around them. The trees had begun to feel alive. The trunks were impossibly wide, their gnarled branches twisting into unnatural shapes as though they were reaching out for them. It was a subtle change at first, just an uncomfortable sense that something was watching. But it didn't take long before it became undeniable. The sound of footsteps, not their own, seemed to echo through the trees, always just behind them. When Michael or Thomas turned to look, there was nothing. Only the dark shadows of the forest stretching long into the distance. Sometimes it felt as if the forest was following them, breathing with them. As they moved further in, the path grew more treacherous. The ground became uneven, and thick roots sprawled across the forest floor like serpents. The light of day was fading faster than it should have been, and Michael realized that they had been walking for what felt like hours, but no sun had broken through the dense canopy above. The strange sounds continued, getting louder and closer. Lily, who had barely spoken since their escape, kept pointing into the trees, her eyes wide and filled with dread. "He's watching us," she would whisper in a voice too soft to be heard over the wind. When asked who she was talking about, she would only reply, "The man with no eyes." It was Thomas who first noticed something truly wrong. At the edge of a small clearing, he spotted an old stone structure, half buried in the underbrush. The stones were large and worn by centuries of rain and wind, their surface cracked and covered in strange symbols that seemed to move if you stared at them too long. Michael approached it cautiously, his breath visible in the chill air. The stone had a disturbing feel to it, an oppressive weight that seemed to press against his chest. "Is this here for protection?" he muttered to himself, running a finger over the symbols. He didn't expect an answer, but there was a part of him that hoped for something, anything, to explain what was happening. Eleanor, still delirious from fever, stumbled up beside him and gasped. "I've seen this before," she murmured, her voice strained. "In my dreams. It's a warning." Thomas, standing behind them, looked nervous. "We don't belong here. This place, it feels wrong." But Michael, ever the protector, refused to believe it. They were survivors, weren't they? This was just another obstacle. They had faced death before, and they would face it again if they had to. The stones were just remnants of a long-forgotten past, nothing more than the remnants of those who had come before them. Still, the unease gnawed at him. As they passed the stone structure, Lily began to cry, not a soft, gentle cry, but a deep, gut-wrenching sob. When Michael knelt beside her, he could see her face twisted in pure terror. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice shaking with worry. "He's here," she whispered, clutching his sleeve. "I saw him. He's watching us." Thomas turned away from the group and squinted into the distance, his eyes narrowing. There, just between the trees, something moved. A figure, tall and thin with its back turned. He could see no features, only the outline of a man, but it wasn't a man, it couldn't be. Michael stood up abruptly. "We need to keep moving, now!" They pushed forward, unwilling to stop for any reason, even as the sounds of their footsteps became drowned out by a distant rumble. Thunder, perhaps? Or something worse? The forest grew darker, the trees now forming a dense wall around them. The path seemed to be leading them deeper into the heart of the woods. Michael tried to reassure the others that they were safe, but his own fear had begun to take root. The air was thick with the scent of rot and decay. The ground beneath their feet became soft, like wet sponge, and the trees, twisted and blackened, seemed to move as they passed, shifting, stretching, bending toward them. Then the first thing happened. A sudden rustling came from the bushes to their left. Thomas's hand shot out, grabbing Michael's arm. The rustling grew louder, more frantic. Something was moving toward them, something fast. A low growl echoed through the trees, a primal sound, one that sent chills running down Michael. The forest had become a labyrinth. Twisted trees, endless shadows, and a feeling of being trapped, even though they were supposed to be free. Every step taken felt like it led them further into the depths of something unnatural. The air grew colder with each passing hour, and the silence of the forest seemed to suffocate them, the faint sounds of their own breathing and footsteps growing louder in their ears. Eleanor's fever had risen again, her body burning hot to the touch. She murmured unintelligible words in her sleep, her eyes flickering beneath closed lids as though trapped in a nightmare. Michael had tried to get her to drink water, but she refused, her lips trembling as she muttered one name over and over again. "Marlon." "Marlon?" Michael repeated softly, leaning close to her ear. "Who's Marlon, Mum?" Her eyes opened for a brief moment, her gaze vacant and distant. He was here before," she whispered hoarsely. "He's the one who watches." Michael's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Who is he?" But she was already slipping back into unconsciousness, her words a tangled mess of incoherence. Thomas, who had been watching the darkening forest from a distance, came over quietly. "There's something wrong with her. She's not just sick, Michael. I think something else is taking hold of her." Michael clenched his fists, fighting the rising panic. They couldn't afford to lose her. Not after everything they had been through, but even as he thought this, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, horribly wrong. They pressed on, though the path had almost completely disappeared beneath the thick carpet of dead leaves and moss-covered ground. The trees were so tightly packed that it felt as though they were being enclosed, like the forest itself was closing in on them. Lily was still silent, her gaze fixed on the space between the trees, her eyes wide and unblinking. Suddenly she stopped in her tracks. "I hear it," she whispered, her voice so soft that Michael barely heard her. "I hear him." Before anyone could respond, Lily stepped forward, her small body moving against their attempts to stop her. The others hesitated, unsure of what she had heard. The wind picked up, but there was something in the air now, a change that they couldn't quite place. The rustling of leaves seemed louder, but not from the wind. The ground trembled slightly beneath their feet, and an odd vibration seemed to crawl up Michael's spine, as though the very earth was alive with some dark, terrible energy. The air grew heavy, charged with an unnatural force. "I told you," Lily whispered again, her voice distant and eerie. "He's here." And then the first sign came. A loud crack echoed through the trees, followed by the unmistakable sound of branches snapping. Michael whipped his head around, scanning the dark, silent woods for any sign of movement. Nothing. The trees stood motionless, their twisted limbs swaying gently in the wind. But the sound had been too close. It was impossible for it to have come from the distance. Then, from deep within the thicket, a figure appeared. It was nothing like the man they had seen before. This one was smaller, crouched, hunched over in the shadows. It had no face, only a gaping, hollow space where its features should have been. And yet, the darkness inside that hollow seemed to draw in the light, making it almost impossible to look at. The thing tilted its head, as if studying them, its limbs twitching unnaturally. Before anyone could react, it vanished into the underbrush, melting back into the shadows like a wisp of smoke. Michael's breath caught in his throat. "Did you see that?" Thomas asked, his voice shaking. Lily's eyes were locked onto the spot where the creature had been, her lips barely moving as she whispered, "It's him, Marlon. He's the one watching. He's the one who keeps us here." Michael's heart raced. He turned to Thomas, trying to steady himself. "We need to get out of here, now." But as the words left his mouth, the forest itself seemed to shift, and the deep, unnatural silence closed in once again. The darkness of the forest pressed down on them, and Michael could feel the weight of it in his chest. Each breath was labored, each step more difficult than the last. The forest seemed to be closing in, the trees bending closer together, their gnarled branches like skeletal hands reaching out as if trying to trap them. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the cold had deepened, seeping into their bones. Eleanor's fever had not subsided, and now she was slipping in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently about something, or someone, that had been following them. Thomas had tried to keep her calm, but the tension in his voice betrayed the fear that had taken root in him. "We need to find shelter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't keep going like this. We need to rest." But Michael wasn't sure if stopping was a good idea. They had no idea where they were, or how far they had gone, and the feeling of being watched had only grown stronger. He couldn't shake the thought that something, or someone, was waiting for them to falter. "We can't stop," Michael replied, his voice hoarse. "If we stop, we might never move again." Lily, who had been eerily silent for the past few hours, finally spoke. "He's out there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's waiting for us to stop. He knows when we're weak." Michael looked down at her, his heart heavy with fear. "Who, Lily? Who's out there?" "Marlon," she said, her voice tinged with a deep, unnatural fear. "He's the one who watches. He's the one who makes us forget." A chill ran down Michael's spine. He remembered the creature they had seen earlier, its hollow face and twisted, gnarled limbs. The image of it lingered in his mind, refusing to fade. "We need to keep moving," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "If we stay here, we'll become part of this place, this forest. It takes things. It makes them disappear." Michael nodded, but his mind was racing. What was Marlon? What did he want? And why was this happening to them? He looked around, his eyes scanning the dark, silent trees, but there was no sign of the creature, no movement, only the oppressive silence. Suddenly a sound cut through the stillness, a soft, almost inaudible whisper, like a breeze brushing against the trees. Michael stopped dead in his tracks, his heart racing. The sound came again, this time louder, and it was unmistakable. A voice. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, so faint it was barely audible, but it felt as though it came from all around them, as if the very air was speaking. Michael's blood ran cold. He spun around, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but there was no one there. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice cracking with fear. Lily nodded, her eyes wide with terror. "It's him, Marlon. He's speaking to us." The trees seemed to grow even darker, their twisted branches stretching farther into the night, blocking out what little light remained. The wind picked up, howling through the forest, and the rustling of leaves sounded like whispers. Suddenly the ground beneath their feet shook. It was subtle at first, but then it grew stronger, and the very earth seemed to groan in agony. Michael grabbed Eleanor tightly, his heart pounding in his chest as the trembling intensified. And then, from the darkness, A figure appeared. The forest seemed to pulse with life, as if the very trees were breathing. Michael's chest tightened with every step, and despite the cold, a bead of sweat trickled down his face. The ground was uneven, shifting beneath their feet, as though the earth itself was in motion. The rustling of leaves no longer sounded like wind, but like the quiet steps of something following them, something that never stopped. Eleanor's fever had escalated, her body now burning so hot that Michael feared she might slip into unconsciousness forever. Thomas had grown increasingly anxious, his eyes constantly darting around the trees as if waiting for something to leap from the shadows. Lily, still eerily silent, kept her gaze locked on the distance, her expression one of deep concentration. As the family continued their uneasy march, the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows thickening with each step. The silence was no longer natural. It was suffocating, oppressive, like a weight pressing against their chests. The only sound was the crunch of their feet on the forest floor and the occasional distant crack of a branch snapping in the distance. Then it happened. A figure emerged from the darkness, moving quickly but silently between the trees. Michael's heart skipped a beat. It was tall, impossibly tall, its long limbs and hunched body moving with a strange, unsettling grace. Its face, or what should have been its face, was hollow, a gaping void of darkness, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just an empty blackness that seemed to suck in the light around it. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. Michael instinctively reached for his rifle, his hand shaking as he gripped the cold metal. But before he could raise it, the figure stopped just beyond the tree line, standing still as though waiting for something. Lily gasped, her voice barely audible. "It's him! Marlon! He's here!" The air grew thick with tension, the hairs on the back of Michael's neck standing on end. He felt a primal urge to flee, to run as fast as he could, but his legs were frozen in place. It was as if the forest itself had trapped him here, as if something beyond his control was forcing him to stay. The figure tilted its head, as if studying them. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its chest, not a sound of any animal Michael had ever heard. It was a noise that felt ancient, like something that had been asleep for centuries, waiting to awaken. "We're not supposed to be here," the creature whispered, its voice low and hollow, echoing through Michael's mind. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The creature did not answer. Instead, it took a step forward, its limbs twisting unnaturally. The trees around them seemed to groan in response, their branches creaking and swaying as if they were alive and reacting to the creature's presence. Then, without warning, the figure lunged, but it didn't move like a person. It was a blur of motion, a dark shadow that seemed to distort the very air around it. It was faster than anything Michael had ever seen, its limbs stretching unnaturally, its form shifting like smoke in the wind. Michael raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the creature was gone, vanished into the trees as if it had never been there. The silence returned, but this time it was even worse. It was deafening, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "What the hell was that?" Thomas whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. Lily's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Marlon, he's not done with us." Michael couldn't bring himself to speak. His heart was racing, his mind a whirl of confusion and terror. They had seen it now. The thing that had been stalking them, the thing that had been watching. And whatever it was far worse than he could have ever imagined. The forest around them seemed to grow even darker, the trees leaning in closer, their twisted limbs like claws reaching for them. "Keep moving," Michael said, his voice barely a whisper. "We have to keep moving." But even as he spoke, a terrible thought gnawed at him. How could they escape something that was already inside their minds? The forest had transformed from a place of refuge into something far more sinister. The trees, once silent and stoic, now seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, their branches twisting and creaking as if they were alive, listening. Michael could hear it. The soft whispers carried on the wind, a language he couldn't understand but that sent a chill down his spine. It was as though the very forest was speaking to them, its voice soft and insistent, urging them deeper into its heart. The family trudged on, exhausted and on edge. Eleanor's condition had worsened, her fever had become relentless, and her once lucid moments had become increasingly fleeting. Her eyes, once filled with love and warmth, were now clouded and distant. Her murmurs were a mix of incoherent words and the name Marlon, repeated like a chant, a haunting reminder that the entity was still watching them, waiting. "Mum, please," Michael whispered, wiping the sweat from her brow. "Stay with us." But Eleanor didn't respond. She was lost in a world of her own, her body racked with fever, her breath shallow and rapid. Michael had no choice but to lift her and carry her in his arms, though his muscles screamed in protest from the weight and the strain. He had to keep moving. There was no time to rest, no time to stop. The forest was closing in, and he could feel the unseen eyes of the trees upon them. Lily, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke in a voice so soft it was barely audible. "They're listening to us." Michael looked at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Who?" "The trees," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They hear everything. They know everything." Thomas, walking ahead, glanced back over his shoulder. "What are you talking about, Lily?" "They hear us," she repeated, her eyes wide with an almost unnatural fear. "They hear our thoughts. They can feel what we feel." The wind howled through the forest, sending a shiver through Michael's body. The trees seemed to sway in unison, their branches creaking as if in response to Lily's words. The sound of rustling leaves grew louder, but it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something more deliberate. Michael stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He heard it now, too. Faint whispers, just at the edge of hearing. It was as though the trees were speaking to each other, their voices low and indistinct. But as the whispers grew louder, Michael realized that they weren't just speaking to each other. They were speaking to him. The words were fragmented, half-formed, like an ancient language trying to claw its way into his mind. "You are not alone. We are always watching." The words echoed in his mind, a chorus of voices carried on the wind. Michael shook his head, trying to block them out, but they persisted, growing louder and more insistent. He could feel his sanity slipping, his grip on reality beginning to fray. "Stop it!" he muttered, pressing his hands against his ears, trying to drown out the voices. But they didn't stop. They only grew louder, more urgent, as though they were trying to tell him something important, something he needed to know. Lily's eyes were wide with fear, her hands trembling. "They're trying to get into our heads. They know our fears." Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet trembled, and Michael stumbled, almost losing his balance. The trees seemed to shudder, as if in response, their roots creaking and groaning, stretching deeper into the earth. The whispers reached a crescendo, a cacophony of voices that seemed to fill every corner of his mind. And then, in the midst of the chaos, a voice broke through, clear and chilling. "Marlon is coming." The words froze Michael in place. His heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the sound, his eyes scanning the trees. But there was nothing. Just darkness and the endless whispers of the forest. The air was thick with tension. Michael could feel it now. The forest was alive, and it was watching them. The trees were no longer just silent witnesses to their plight. They were part of the nightmare, a force that was closing in around them, pulling them deeper into the forest's grip. "Keep moving," Michael ordered, his voice hoarse with fear. "We can't stay here." But the forest didn't let them go. It was already too late. The further they ventured into the forest, the more detached Michael felt from reality. The whispers had not stopped. If anything, they had intensified, curling around his mind like tendrils of smoke, suffocating every rational thought he tried to hold on to. The wind carried with it more than just the rustling of leaves now. It seemed to carry the very essence of the forest itself, the ancient dark presence that pulsed beneath the earth. He could see it in Thomas's eyes. The madness was creeping in too. The subtle way his brother's hands trembled, the constant flickering of his gaze to the shadows, like he was expecting something to leap out at him. Thomas had always been the strong one, the protector. But now he was unraveling. The walls that kept him grounded were breaking down piece by piece. Michael's heart raced as he tried to maintain control. He had to keep them moving. They couldn't stop. If they stopped, they'd be lost. The family needed to find safety or else. But what was safety anymore? Was there any safety in this cursed place? Eleanor had not spoken for hours. She lay in Michael's arms, her body still burning with fever, her eyes half-lidded and distant. Every now and then she would whisper the name Marlon, as if caught in a fever dream, repeating the name like a prayer to a deity that wasn't there to answer. Her once warm and comforting presence was now a mere shadow of what she had been, lost to the fever that ravaged her body. Lily, however, had grown disturbingly quiet. Her wide, haunted eyes no longer seemed to focus on anything in particular. She walked with her head down, shoulders hunched, as if she could no longer bear the weight of the world above her. Her silence was worse than the frantic ramblings of the others. It was as though she was slipping away from them, becoming something else, something that didn't belong. "Marlon," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible, barely there. "He's not just in the forest, he's in us now." Michael stopped dead in his tracks. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low, strained. Lily lifted her head, her eyes wide and unblinking, her face pale as death. "He's inside us, Michael. He's always been inside us." A cold shiver ran down Michael's spine. "What are you talking about?" "He's in our blood," Lily continued, her voice growing more distant, as if she were no longer speaking to him, but to the forest itself. "He's in our thoughts. He's been watching us since the moment we stepped into the trees. He's part of us, always has been." "No," Michael whispered, shaking his head. "That's not possible. You're just—" But Lily was no longer listening. Her words grew quieter, more disconnected, until she stopped altogether, her eyes glazed over as if she were in a trance. The strange, hollow emptiness in her gaze made Michael's stomach turn. The forest around them was growing darker, the trees stretching higher into the sky, their twisted limbs blocking out the little light that remained. The whispers continued, growing louder, and Michael could no longer tell if they were coming from the trees, the wind, or his own mind. The voices seemed to blend together, filling his ears with maddening urgency, and then just as quickly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. It was worse than the noise. "We need to find shelter," Thomas said suddenly, his voice hoarse. It was the first time he had spoken in what felt like an eternity. His eyes were wide with panic. "If we don't, we'll—" But before he could finish his sentence, a sharp cry broke the stillness. It was Eleanor. Michael whipped around, his heart in his throat, but Eleanor was still in his arms, her eyes wide open, staring at him with an expression he had never seen before, empty. Her body was rigid, her mouth stretched into a smile that didn't belong to her, a cruel, twisted grin that made Michael's blood run cold. She whispered, her voice hoarse and hollow, "Marlon says we can't leave." "No one leaves." A chill ran through Michael's veins as the words sank in. Marlon. The entity wasn't just a presence in the forest, it was more. It was the forest, it was everything, and now it was in her too. Michael staggered back in horror, dropping to his knees, clutching his sister tightly. "No. No, Eleanor. Please." But the smile never wavered. Her eyes, though still fevered, were empty, vacant, as though something had taken hold of her completely. It wasn't her anymore. She had become a vessel, a conduit for something far darker. The forest around them seemed to lean in closer, its whispers growing louder, more urgent. The trees seemed to move. The darkness had consumed them. Every step forward felt like another step away from what was real, from the world they knew. Michael's mind raced as he carried Eleanor's lifeless body, her skin cold and clammy against him. The air around them was thick with an oppressive weight, as if the forest itself was pressing down on them, suffocating them with its unrelenting presence. The trees had stopped whispering, but the silence was just as deafening. The wind had died, and even the usual night sounds of insects and animals were gone. There was no movement, no life, just the heavy, suffocating quiet that hung over them like a dark shroud. Lily walked ahead of them, her steps slow and deliberate, her gaze fixed on something far off in the distance. Thomas had fallen behind, his expression one of distant panic, as though he were too lost in his own fear to focus on anything around him. "We have to keep moving," Michael muttered to himself, though he wasn't sure he even believed it anymore. Where were they going? What were they running from? Every tree, every shadow seemed to be a part of the nightmare that had taken hold of them. The very earth beneath their feet felt alien, as though they were no longer walking on soil, but on something far darker, something ancient and cursed. "Marlon," Lily whispered, her voice breaking the silence like a cold gust of wind. "He's getting closer." Michael glanced at her, his heart sinking. "What do you mean?" She turned to face him, her eyes hollow and distant, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's not just in the forest anymore. He's in our heads, Michael. He's inside us." Michael felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The terror in Lily's eyes was real. She wasn't just hallucinating. Marlon wasn't a mere presence in the trees. He wasn't just the thing they'd been running from. He was a part of them now. The realization hit Michael with full force, and the weight of it crushed him. He had tried to ignore the signs, the subtle shifts in their behavior, the whispers that had turned into voices in his head. But now he understood. Marlon had already claimed them, all of them. One by one they had been consumed by the very thing they had hoped to outrun. Thomas suddenly dropped to his knees, his hands clutching his head as if trying to hold his mind together. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. It's coming for us," he muttered, his voice broken. "We can't escape, we can't outrun it." "Thomas, get up," Michael shouted, his voice rough with desperation. But Thomas didn't move. He only continued to whisper incoherently, his body shaking. And then Michael saw it. At first, it was a faint shadow, just a flicker in the corner of his eye. But as he turned toward it, the figure became clearer. Marlon, or what was left of him. The creature was standing at the edge of the trees, its long, twisted form barely visible in the darkness. The black void where its face should have been seemed to absorb the light around it, casting an impenetrable darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly. The figure was taller than before, its limbs elongated and grotesque, and its presence was suffocating, like the weight of an entire storm about to break. "You can't hide from me," the voice came, though it was not spoken aloud. It was inside Michael's head, a whisper that crawled beneath his skin, deep into his soul. "You are mine, all of you, always." Michael's breath caught in his throat. He could feel it now, the pull of Marlon's presence, the suffocating grip on his mind. It wasn't just the forest anymore, it was them. He could feel it inside him, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness, dragging him deeper into despair. "No," Michael whispered, stepping back. But there was nowhere to run, no escape. The heart of the forest had closed in around them, and they were trapped. The figure in the shadows moved closer, its limbs twisting and contorting unnaturally, like the very fabric of reality was bending in response to its presence. It wasn't just watching them. It was feeding off them, feeding off their fear. "Help me!" Thomas's voice was barely a whisper, but Michael heard it loud and clear. His brother was breaking down, lost to the entity's hold. Michael wanted to help, to do something, but the terror that gripped him was paralyzing. He couldn't think, he couldn't move, and then, just as he thought he couldn't bear it anymore, the figure stopped. The air grew colder, and the world seemed to freeze in place. "I will have all of you," Marlin's voice echoed, low and menacing. "You will never leave." In this part, the family reaches the heart of the forest, where Marlin reveals himself as more than just an entity. He is the forest, and he has already taken hold of them. Michael's realization that they can't escape creates a deep sense of hopelessness, pushing the family to the brink. The world was closing in on them, each breath heavier than the last, as if the very air was being suffocated by the presence of Marlin. The creature, no longer a mere whisper in the wind, stood before them, its form shifting and warping in ways that defied nature. The trees around them groaned under its weight, bending toward the creature as if they, too, were drawn to its malevolent force. Michael's heart raced, his thoughts scattered. He couldn't think clearly. Marlin had taken hold of his mind, invaded it, filling every corner with darkness. The creature had already claimed his family. What remained of them was merely a hollow shell. "Marlin," Michael's voice cracked, trembling with fear and defiance. "What do you want from us?" The creature's form rippled, and in that moment, Michael saw something. A flicker of something familiar, something human. The dark void where its face should have been contorted into a grotesque parody of a smile. "I want everything," Marlin whispered, the voice seeping into Michael's bones. "I want your souls. I want your fear. I want to break you." Thomas, who had been crouched on the ground in a state of shock, suddenly rose to his feet, his eyes wild with terror. "No, no more!" he shouted, his voice raw. "We're not yours!" But even as he spoke, the darkness seemed to press closer, wrapping around his words, silencing him. Lily, her face pale and eyes vacant, stepped forward, her gaze locked on the creature. "He's right," she murmured, her voice distant. We're not his." A moment of clarity flashed in Michael's mind. He remembered something his father had once told him. "The forest can only take what you give it," his father had said. "If you stand firm, you can break the bond. You must not give it your fear, not your soul." Michael turned to his remaining family members, his voice shaking with determination. "We can fight this. We can break free. We have to stand together." Thomas's eyes locked onto Michael's, and for the first time since they entered the forest, Michael saw something resembling hope in his brother's gaze. But it wasn't enough. The shadows continued to stretch and twist, closing in around them, suffocating them, pulling at their very souls. Marlin's laughter echoed through the trees, a low, mocking sound that reverberated in their minds. "You think you can resist me?" the creature taunted. "You are already mine, all of you." But Michael clenched his fists, his mind racing with the final plan that had taken form. There was one thing Marlin had overlooked: the power of the family bond. They were stronger together than they were apart. If they could unite their will, they might be able to push back. "Hold on to each other," Michael whispered urgently. "Remember who we are. We are a family. We've survived this long because of that. We'll survive because we are strong. Together." Thomas and Lily reached for each other's hands, their eyes filled with something fierce and determined, even as the darkness continued to press in. The family formed a tight circle, each of them grasping hands, pulling their strength from one another. "Marlin!" Michael shouted, his voice rising above the creature's oppressive presence. "You cannot have us! We are not yours to claim!" For a moment, there was silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Then, the creature's laughter turned to a howl of rage. The darkness trembled, swirling violently around them, but Michael and his family stood firm, unyielding in the face of the storm. In the distance, a glimmer of light appeared, faint but unmistakable. It grew stronger, brighter. And as it did, the oppressive darkness seemed to recede, its grip loosening, if only for a moment. Michael could feel the pull of the light, and with it, a sense of strength. The bond they shared, the love, the courage, the survival instinct, it was their weapon. It was the key. And in that moment, Michael knew what they had to do. The creature shrieked, its form twisting in agony, as if the very essence of its being was unraveling. The light grew stronger, and the forest around them seemed to tremble with the force of their collective will. With one final, desperate push, the family focused all their strength, their unity, into the light. For a brief second, the world was engulfed in blinding radiance, and then everything went still. In this part, the family's unity becomes their strength as they confront Marlon head-on. Their defiance against the creature is symbolized by their bond as a family, allowing them to tap into an ancient power that momentarily pushes back against the darkness. The suspense and uncertainty linger, but there's a glimmer of hope that they might overcome the nightmare that has ensnared them.